We're seeing GenAI used to generate code, and that's one thing. And then there's GenAI to refactor code, which is quite a different problem, especially code that it didn't write and that maybe a human wrote. And it seems to me that code generation is easy. Code refactoring is not easy. Is that fair?
Yeah, it seems to be the case. I mean, it's, I think there's more degrees of freedom to go and generate a solution than there are to go and actually take something and preserve its behavior and change its structure at the same time, right? So I think, that is significant. And what's funny to me is that we have so much tooling to go and actually check refactorings. They're built into like refactoring IDEs and stuff like that. And here we're kind of starting from scratch, going and saying, okay, let's just sort of throw an LM at the problem and sort of like see what we get.
Yeah.
So I think, we're going to get much better with this. The thing I'm really excited about within the past half year or so is that people are baking in chain of thought, a particular prompting technique, into the LLMs themselves. And whereas about a year ago, there was a problem getting LLMs to basically do planning for you, like to plan its own work, it's getting much better at that. They are getting much better at that. So I think the kind of procedural reasoning that we use in order to go and basically make sure that we're preserving behavior when we refactor is something that, AI is going to get better and better at. But for right now, it's kind of like it's a bit of a mixed bag. And, I love having tests. So you have tests, you can validate the refactorings a bit, and that's great.
But you have that thing, you touched on it, that for IDEs, refactoring IDEs, certainly for statically typed languages, already are very good at being able to change code in a way which they know will not change behavior, because they have been built with a concept and an understanding of the language and the type system, right? Whereas the LLMs don't do that, right? They're giving us plausible answers. So you kind of touched on this aspect of tests. And I saw some research that was done by the team at CodeScene recently, where they looked at some of the best models for code refactoring that are out there. And they found that the top 5 models they looked at were pretty good at making sure the code compiled. Like they sometimes the code wouldn't compile. Sometimes it would, sometimes it wouldn't. They were terrible at ensuring that tests still passed. So in other words, when asked to do refactoring, the code looked plausibly like compiling code, but it didn't pass those tests. And like coming back to your book, that was an essential tenet of like your definition of legacy software being code without tests, right? So you kind of have to define some tests before you do the work to make sure that when you do the work, you haven't broken the system. So it feels to me like those tests are still as important as ever, if not more important in this one.
And it's funny because as you say that, I'm thinking that one of the things to recognize as software developers is that we should know what we want. If we don't know what we want, we'll get things that we don't, that may not be right, okay? And I guess tests are a good way of going and actually sort of like solidifying the idea in our mind about what we want, right? I've run a number of experiments going and sort of like taking tests for existing projects and basically going and trying to generate code from them using LLMs. And it's interesting with that because then you start to see what some of the limitations are with that.
Yeah.
But I think in general, it's kind of nice to go and actually have those tests, as you develop to go and sort of solidify your notion of the behavior that you want. And then basically you have something to go and compare what the generation is against.
So I mean, that's kind of a question that sort of JF posits around this, which is, could we use AI to generate the test harness, right? That we, as a starting point, is that something that's feasible?
Yeah, it is. And I think, back when first people were first like trying this out, I thought, oh, that's horrible. It's a really horrible idea, right? So I'd seen so many bad attempts at that in the past. But more and more now, I'm feeling that like if you have a code base that doesn't have much in the way of tests, it's fine to go and generate tests because in a way, the code is going to check the tests that are produced, right? So basically, if the tests you generated actually do compile and give you coverage, they are holding behavior in place, and you can use that as leverage to move forward with things. The thing where it gets kind of messed up is when you're generating tests as well as generating code at the same time. That's kind of like, there's no source of truth at that point in time. So I think, I've done that a bit of just, having a generate test for things that I don't have tests for. And, it's hit and miss with that, but at least there is a check with that because you can check against the current behavior and see that you're really kind of characterizing it well. So.
And that's a key part, isn't it? I mean, it's like, if you have the same LLM generate the test and the behavior, I'd be surprised if they didn't work, right? But also, like, if you are going to do this, people, and generate a test harness to help with application modernization, make sure the test pass before you make any changes to the system, right? Because otherwise you're going to get yourself into trouble. I mean, that idea of bootstrapping test harnesses, it's not a new idea. I mean, if I think about the early days of things like Selenium, for example, you would, to bootstrap a test harness for an old application, you would literally go and do some manual tests running a recorder, and that would generate scripts that would then be your bootstrap. The idea being that would be the starting point for your harness. So having GenAI do that, it doesn't seem like a bad idea. I think but I think we should see it probably as a starting point rather than that being an ongoing thing that we can do, right?
Yeah, fair enough. And we want our test space to be decent documentation of what the system does, right? And so the degree that we can go and generate tests and kind of like vet them or like review them and say, this one's giving me value, maybe this one isn't, maybe I need to handwrite this one, that kind of thing. We can have these test service documentation as well as ways of preserving behavior when we refactor. So.
KH kind of asked a question around this test, because we choose the word test kind of interchangeably there, but they said, are we talking about unit tests or integration tests? We talk about the tests that you might want in place before you say modernize an application. If you don't have a test harness, what kind of test would you need to start with?
Well, it depends on your scope with these things. One of the things I got as a ding in the book that I wrote ages ago was that I didn't really talk too much about end-to-end testing. And I think what it comes down to for me is noticing that whenever you're making changes in a system, it is what's in front of you. It's not, everything in the world, right? And it's kind of like I tend to think of the tests that I write as unit tests when I'm basically going and putting tests in the system that doesn't have much tests. But the thing is, in general, they often tend to sort of like increase in scope a bit. So they're covering larger areas of behavior that usually are like a set of classes, coordinating with each other. From that point of view, that you're getting tests in place to support refactoring or support local work, you're going to pick a scope that's appropriate for you. One that's easy to go and get tests around and also gives you the good coverage that you need for what you're about to do. So I don't really think in terms of unit versus integration all that much. I find that as a matter of practice, quite often you go and you get tests against some very large class, and then you start extracting classes out from it. And then you're kind of like, okay, well, let's see, do I need tests for those classes I extracted, or am I okay with the coverage I'm getting from the original class that they extracted from? And you can go back and forth answering that question, but I find that I quite often have tests that are like in that gray area between integration and unit when I'm working this way. So.
And that kind of makes sense to me, because often when you're modernizing a system, you're having to do it because the code you're dealing with right now is hard to work with. And the reason it's hard to work with is often because the code was built with a certain mindset, and your mental models and the mental models of the team around you don't match what the code is like right now. So you're almost having to change the code to match the mental models you're using. So it's kind of an iterative process of refining that a little bit, isn't it? It is you're over here, the code base is over there. It's like you're trying to bring it along, and I guess you having to apply tests at different levels to make that happen. But almost in a way, I think coming back to your idea about test as documentation, for me, it's almost like that test is that concrete representation of what my mental model is at this moment in time.
Yeah, so I agree about the mental model thing. The thing that I think is interesting to me is I always try to go back to, what does the system really do? Because like we have our ideas about what we think it should do, and we have our ideas about what it does. But just to kind of like, segue into the slight, topic about this, I really think that the frame of mind that you really need when you're going and working with tests in a code base, large code base, is what questions do I need to ask? What do I want to know, right? And so, if you're trying to understand something and you can write a test to go and actually give you an answer and tell you what it's currently doing now, that's great. So it's kind of like I sort of like hone in on that particular way of dealing with things. And of course, you will have a mental model of where you want to go and stuff like that. But I'm always kind of like, you are here right now. Yeah. Understand where you are. So I'm sorry to rant about this, but it's just kind of like it's a thing that I like to rant about.